Hello and welcome to Right Around the Murray Festival. I'm Jenni Munday. I'm an academic at Charles Sturt University. I'm also a member of the WAM committee. I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri elders in the Wiradjuri country on which the WAM Festival is based here in Albury. I'm delighted today to welcome James Dunk to the studio. So hello James, it's quite delightful to have you with us. I'm going to introduce you. James is the author of Bedlam at Botany Bay, and a newsflash for anyone not attached to the Facebook page for Right Around the Murray is that James' book, Bedlam at Botany Bay, won the Australian History Prize and the New South Wales Premier's History Awards last Friday, and that it was also shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards and the Ernest Scott Prize and Kay Daniels Award. So congratulations, James, that's really fabulous.
Thank you.
So James is an historian and writer living and working in Sydney. On his webpage, he says that he writes about mental illness, mental health, planetary illness and planetary health. And on the webpage, you can see the reviews of his book, and I commend them to you. They're really interesting. The webpage is jamesdunk, all one word, .com. I'm just going to read the first one, the judges' comments from the New South Wales Premier's Awards 2020. James Dunk's Bedlam at Botany Bay is a truly innovative book. We are presented with a challenging and confronting history of madness in the early years of New South Wales, constructed from diverse sources including governors' letters, colonial secretaries' correspondence, institutional records and private letters. James reveals extraordinary details about how colonial structures, life and circumstances drove people mad, and he invites us to reflect on the implications of the exceptionally coercive nature of a penal colony. And at the end of James' talk, we will be able to take questions, so you can submit them during the chat function. But I welcome you, James, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny, and to the organisers of the festival for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for listening on today. The pandemic rages around us, doesn't it? Every talk and article and poem and news column leads with it, and many conversations, calls and messages. All of us are breathlessly writing a collective story about a virus, about a disease, and about ourselves. 30 years ago, the great medical historian Charles Rosenberg wrote that epidemics start at a moment in time, follow a plot line of increasing and revelatory tension, move to a crisis of individual and collective character, then drift towards closure. The public nature and dramatic intensity of an epidemic mean that they necessarily reveal a great deal about the cultures that are wrestling with them. Consider the stories told in the pandemic, stories about human strength and weakness, the moral actions of viral organisms, the trade-off between public good and individual liberty, states' rights, family rights, about the relative cost of death and lockdown. Stories are how we negotiate the public health measures that aim to contain the virus and conquer it. An epidemic makes a ruthless transverse cut through a society, leaving a raw cross-section of all these stories, institutional forms and cultural patterns, which otherwise lie neatly under the superficial membrane of laws and norms and manners. A pandemic, of course, reveals fault lines and forms across the breadth and depth of the human world, as biological reality lays waste to human delusions of control. There are thousands of curves and endless comparisons, and there is always somewhere worse. Rosenberg distinguished between disease epidemics, which are characterized by fear and sudden widespread death, as we know all so well, from other so-called epidemics, like drug and alcohol addiction or obesity. Some seek to clothe these health patterns in the emotional urgency that is associated with disease epidemics. So for decades, we've heard about epidemic levels of mental illness. In Australia, it has been one of our leading public health challenges in recent years. But despite fascinating accounts of mass hysteria and panic and other psychological effects, mental illness does not conform to the epidemiological modeling of infectious disease. It's precisely the kind of phenomenon for which one might want to borrow the language of the epidemic in order to raise its profile and to achieve policy changes. But where COVID is an event which will move through its awful complications to a high point of crisis, and after loved ones are buried and our world begins to recover, move through to catharsis, mental illnesses appear to be endemic. This means that it forms one of the cultural shapes dissected and exposed by a deadly global event like the COVID-19 pandemic. We've read and heard and seen mental health effects associated with the pandemic and with the public health measures put in place to combat it. Lockdown, economic recession, loneliness and grief, the psychological struggle against an invisible enemy that might be lurking in the supermarket, the train, the school, the playground, the nursing home. These are all intersections between viral organisms, social and cultural forms, and the human psyche. The pandemic has aggravated the set of afflictions and conditions, disorders and diseases which we refer to as mental illness. Globally, 1 in 4 will experience a mental or neurological disorder during their lifetime, according to the World Health Organization. And the Black Dog Institute has found that each year 1 in 5 Australians will experience mental illness. Mental illness is more and more discussed and debated and treated. We've worked hard over some generations to separate mental illness out, to study it, and to treat those who suffer from it. We have hundreds of new diagnoses and new theoretical pathways, and we have an array of psychopharmaceuticals that are marshaled against them. We also have new ways of talking about therapies and consultations as mental health services, and those who access them as clients and consumers. This is not to say that we've made all that much progress. For all our efforts, depression, anxiety, mania, delusion, delirium, and psychosis seem to run rampant across modern experience, plunging countless lives into misery and despair, carving apart families and communities, and leaving everywhere deep and painful scars. If our understanding of disease ecology assures us that epidemics and pandemics will always come at last to an end, there are no such limits or guarantees with mental illness. It stretches on ahead and around us. And yet, we rarely talk about madness in the present tense. The word mad, or one of its counterparts, might land here and there. He belongs in a madhouse. It's getting a bit stir-crazy here. This WH&S policy is insane. But that is not what I mean by madness. I take madness to be the cultural, social, and political tangle that is generated as mental illness unravels individual thoughts and feelings and undoes selves, so that those thoughts and selves spill out through personal relationships and interpersonal interactions, spread through communities and further into the public sphere and into social structures. And this phenomenon we do not really talk about. It may well be that our conversations about mental illness and our efforts to treat it interfere with our understanding of that larger phenomenon of madness. We're talking about the ways that mental illness is registered and received and interpreted. Mental illness involves an internal disorder, a private chaos. Madness is what happens when that chaos meets the external world. What happens is inevitably a clash of the frames and content of the internal world with the rules and expectations and laws that govern space and that police acceptable behavior. As the dust settles from that clash, it reveals new territory, new landscape, new paths taken through it. Paths that are unpredictable, problematic, and very often unsettling. My book, Bedlam at Botany Bay, is a history of madness. I tell the story of the first years of modern colonial Australia by attending to the threshold between illness and madness. I look at the ways the internal chaos of mental illness worked out amongst convicts and soldiers and officers and settlers, as well as magistrates and governors and British secretaries riding over the seas, and the way this burst and rippled through the colony. I found that this was the natural approach to take, and perhaps even the only way to do justice to the subject. Because New South Wales typically lacked the categories and the institutions, the asylums, the hospitals, and the physical and the legal concepts that were elsewhere used to neatly separate those who are ill from those who are not. Here all boundaries were partial, temporary, discretionary, permeable. Let me illustrate this with a story, the story which opens my book. It begins with a frustrated young suitor, John Grant, shooting at a lawyer called Spencer in a botched duel in St. James Court, London. During the shooting, Grant broke the gilded conventions of dueling at least 3 times. First, he tried to coerce an esteemed and aging lawyer to fight him, accosting him in the street with 2 pistols. Second, when the old man chose not to fight, but hit him with his walking stick and ran away, John Grant shot him in the back. And third, and really the final straw, he walked up to the old lawyer as he lay on the ground and shot him again. It would have been, of course, a murder charge and a very different sort of story, except that Grant had loaded the pistols with a fine swan shot used for shooting game. And so in a fourth and very strange development, he only left a few superficial wounds on Spencer's upper thigh and lower jacket. And yet there was some damage done. The incident laid waste to 18th century ideas of masculinity, honor, and romance, of course. But the real damage was to John Grant himself. The judge was not convinced by the efforts of the insanity, this insanity defense mounted by Grant's lawyer, and he instructed the jury to ignore that. The young and obviously confused man was sentenced to death. But shortly before his execution, this was commuted to transportation. And so he was placed in a hulk on the Thames and then aboard the Coromandel, bound for New South Wales. It quickly became clear that for this traveller, the line between convict and free person would be quite blurred. He travelled in style and comfort with his piano harpsichord, some silverware, and some silk brocade, and was even offered some space in the captain's cabin during the voyage. He and the officers got along swimmingly, and he felt himself absolutely one of them and not one of the 199 abominable villains, as he wrote home, whom the government had given him for company. They were really the only thing marring what he wrote of, with some reason, as his emigration. New South Wales opened up before him as a place to restore his reputation, build a fortune, and perhaps come home and finish his courtship. If the judicial boundaries were blurred here, so was the threshold between sanity and insanity, rationality and irrationality. At the trial at the Old Bailey in London, Grant's lawyer tried to argue that he was not responsible for the crime because he was insane. And he called 6 witnesses who all thought that John Grant was hopeless, desperate, obsessive, deluded. He certainly struggled at the edge of what we understand to be rational, reasonable behaviour. He recklessly courted a wealthy heiress whom he had little chance of marrying, and when he was thwarted and insulted, he became abusive, and he shot the family lawyer. And after completing his emigration with everything possible in his favour, including a little capital, a fortunate assignment to a very kindly man, and letters of introduction to some of Sydney's most influential citizens, he wrecked everything. He fell in with some radicals and took up the cause of the oppressed, the same people he'd once dismissed as villains, writing seditious poems and diatribes against the governor and the other officers in the colony. When he complained to Richard Atkins, the judge advocate, Atkins told him, "Mr. Grant, you are acting so much against your own interests that I can guess the only cause is supposing you mad. Why do you espouse in this way the cause of the prisoners?" he said. "We have never treated you as a prisoner." The next day, John Grant sent word to Atkins that he was a drunkard and a traitor. Even this kind of behaviour might have been laughed away for a well-educated and connected man like this. But in 1804, the year prior, hundreds of Irish convicts had taken up arms and marched on Parramatta, hoping to overthrow their English oppressors in Sydney and then sail home to help with the rebellion in Ireland. In the general anxiety that engulfed the colony, John Grant's quixotic complaints and his attacks on the system of slavery, as he said, around him, these offences to the Magna Charta and to His Majesty's sensibilities, all became something more serious. Like other difficult people, he was sent to Norfolk Island for hard labour, and probably as a second exile to silence him. But he continued on and on and on. He was imprisoned, chained, whipped, and exiled for a third time to the tiny landmass of Norfolk Island, where he nearly died. At every stage, he would not or could not do what was in his best interests, and so he suffered terribly, far more than his more rational, strategic, and dangerous friends. John Grant was never mentally ill, but he did come into close contact with mental illness. His friend and housemate Charles Bishop slipped into mania after his own business partner was lost at sea, together with all their prospects, in an illegal trade venture to Peru. Grant often visited Bishop in what he called the Sydney Asylum. It was really just a room or two set aside in Parramatta Jail for those who were categorized as insane. Bishop was mad enough to be classified as ill. I mean, his illness fit the medico-legal criteria. It checked enough boxes for a diagnosis. Grant, in the judgment of British and colonial justice, and in the judgment of his acquaintances, simply made a series of catastrophically bad choices. He was never diagnosed by a doctor or certified at law, but he was whispered about, talked about. Jokes were made behind his back. The eccentricity which led him into so much strife also at other times led him into the care and compassion of some of the ordinary people he encountered. When he finally sailed home, he carried with him a remarkable document, a certificate of sanity from the former governor, William Bligh, and also a picture of a racehorse from the chaplain, Samuel Marsden, which was for members of his family. Marsden wrote a letter to them asking if they could help Grant, and it ended with this succinct and sad summary of the story that I've just told. He was transported to this country some years ago in consequence of firing at a gentleman whom he had challenged and who had refused to fight him. The difference originated about a young woman to whom he was attached. His case was always considered a hard one in this colony. His conduct has been very good, strictly moral, and sober. There is a wildness about him, probably occasioned by his troubles. There are countless examples of the blurring of boundaries in colonial New South Wales, especially around madness. When those medical and legal criteria were met, and persons defined as insane were separated from those accepted as sane, this separation was one of the key responses. Physical walls were the obvious manifestation of the boundary line. And so when the first asylum was converted from a barn at the old government farm at Castle Hill, one of the few very basic improvements to the site was a wooden fence that was supposed to maintain that boundary. But the fence was soon in a state of disrepair, and residents of the asylum and those that followed frequently escaped, rejecting their therapy and challenging the categories in which they had been placed. I'd like to share a few pages of my book with you now, which are situated here within this question of the border zone between sanity and insanity, confinement and liberty. It throws up important questions about who takes control and who has authority in a place like colonial Sydney. So this is from Chapter 5, The Politics of a Penal Colony, from a section about families. It's lightly edited for the reading. Families tend to come together in at least a semi-secure environment. In New South Wales, they gathered together against a storm of isolation, alienation, and exile, of depression and derangement. Madness tested and strained family bonds. It might overflow in wretchedness and violence, but it could also prove the strength of love in difficult places. Madness reveals families in crisis, at their most intimate and stripped back. The Levies were a remarkable family. Several of the children of Deborah and Moses Lyon Levy of Whitechapel, London, migrated to New South Wales, but not together. Some came as transported convicts, some as free migrants, but even those who were convicted seemed almost to be seeking a passage. The first to arrive in New South Wales was Solomon Levy, transported in 1813, age 19, as an accessory to the theft of 90 pounds of tea in a wooden chest. He fared spectacularly well, buying a property in George Street for £400, a house in Kent Street, and a piece of land, all apparently before he received his free pardon on 8th of February 1819. 3 days later, he married Anne Jane Roberts, the daughter of another wealthy emancipist, proprietor of the King's Arms on Hunter and Castlereagh Streets. And Solomon continued to prosper as a storekeeper, shipbroker, and agent. Barnett Levy arrived in 1821 as probably the first free Jewish migrant to the Australian colonies. He was a successful businessman and banker, and he's hailed as the father of the Australian theatre. Other siblings who migrated included Isaac, who became a leader of the early Jewish community. Several short biographies have been written about the Levies, but none about the eldest child, Samuel. He was convicted in 1821 of stealing a bundle of gowns, aprons, handkerchiefs, caps, and a petticoat from a widow while walking along Houndsditch in London's East End. He'd already served 4 years of a previous sentence on the hulk Bellerophon and was now sentenced to transportation. He arrived in Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, late in 1821, aged 30. 6 months later, Solomon appears to have contrived to have his brother assigned to himself, and Samuel went to live with him and with Anne in Sydney. The couple were in some strife, however. Solomon had advertised in August 1821 that he would no longer be liable for any debts Anne might incur. We can only wonder what might have come before this. Still, Anne continued living with her husband and her brother-in-law. But within a year, Samuel exacerbated everything by assaulting his sister-in-law. Perhaps there was more than one incident, since Anne is reported as reluctant to see Samuel punished, under the consideration that he was insane. The keeper of Sydney Jail complained to Provost Marshal John Thomas Campbell about Samuel Levy, who was then awaiting trial and proving difficult. Campbell passed the information in turn to the Colonial Secretary, Frederick Goulburn. Levy had been a madman for several months, he wrote, and it appears to me from all that I know and have heard of this man that he is a much fitter inmate for the asylum at Castle Hill than for the jail. Levy, he said, is a prisoner of the Crown, and of course is disposable at His Excellency the Governor's discretion. If a question should arise in regard to the fact of his being lunatic, a medical survey and consultation, if ordered by government, would ascertain the fact. This discretionary power was displayed in a brief letter from Goulburn to the Chief Constable at Sydney about the convict John Matlin, then at the Carter's Barracks. The lunatic named in the margin you will take into your charge, wrote Goulburn, and convey with the accompanying letter to Parramatta, for the purpose of being forwarded to the Castle Hill Asylum. The Colonial Secretary wrote with the Governor's authority, so confident in it that he felt no need to even mention it. Nor was there any mention of any magistrate or court or doctor, just a note to the local authority about logistics. Samuel Levy either never made it to the asylum or came and went. The records fail us. 6 months after Campbell wrote to Goulburn about his brother, Solomon Levy wrote his own letter to Goulburn. He wrote to ask for assistance, and I quote him, "Unfortunately having a brother who is a prisoner of the Crown and a lunatic. Of late, his malady has got to that pitch I very much fear he will do something or some other person an injury." Whatever had happened earlier in the year, he now saw that institutional care was necessary, and he clothed his request in official language, requesting an order for the lunatic's reception at the Castle Hill Asylum. For all their criminality, the Levies retained plenty of agency, and it was a delicate letter, asking for government help, but avoiding the discretionary mechanisms of the governor's disposal of convicts. That the Levies were established in the colony among respectable people was perfectly clear from the witness Solomon called to substantiate his brother's illness, William Cowper. An evangelical chaplain, Cowper was tireless in his pastoral visits, especially to children and to prisoners, and when he died in 1858, fully a third of the people of New South Wales turned out to farewell him. The good chaplain had been recently, said Solomon, disturbed at unseasonable hours on mad applications by Samuel. The letter, riddled though it was with spelling errors, showed that the family had both money and connections, which were the real currency in this aspirational and lopsided society. "I have tried all means medical advice would allow at the suggestion of William Bowman, Esquire, the principal surgeon," wrote Solomon. "I tried a private apartment and had a proper person to attend him with medical advice, but all to no effect. As my own premises does not allow the conveniency sufficient to keep him closely confined, I am willing to pay all expenses to the government as to his victualling, medical attendance, clothing, and any other charge that may be required for the care of my brother at the Castle Hill Madhouse." Transportation was a sort of lottery, just as the English jurist Jeremy Bentham said. When convicts showed signs of madness, the response depended significantly on whether they were assigned to a settler or to the government, and according to the character and capabilities of their masters and commandants and colonial secretaries, of doctors and magistrates, and even families. Some convicts were assigned to their wives or husbands. Samuel Levy was assigned to his brother. This meant that Solomon was perfectly, if rather oddly, placed to liaise with the government on Samuel's behalf, and also that, unlike most masters, he was actually willing to pay for his way. It transpired that the governor's powers over convict madness, supposedly comprehensive and discretionary, were limited. In December 1823, a month after Solomon had requested help, Goldwyn wrote to William Bennett, the superintendent of the asylum. "When was Levy received at your establishment?" he wanted to know, together with the date and reason of his subsequent discharge. The governor and the colonial secretary were chasing down a convict patient. This game of tag was not as uncommon as we might imagine. Just weeks later, Goldwyn wrote again to the superintendent about another patient and discovered that he'd been discharged 3 years earlier and assigned to a master tailor in Parramatta called Dixon. On the reverse of this letter, the governor scribbled for his secretary's attention, "Transmit to me every particular you are able to collect respecting Patrick Logan, a convict." A month later, they were still writing back and forth about Patrick Logan. At one point in 1826, the superintendent of convicts wrote to the governor asking, "Who lives in the lunatic asylum and has the immediate charge of the convicts?" It was something of an ordeal with Samuel Levy, too. Wherever he'd been, on whatever authority, Samuel was admitted to Castle Hill in January 1824. Several months later, however, Bennett reported that he had run away. He had been informed, he said, that Levy was now taken care of by his friends in Sydney. In the normal course of events, runaways from asylums were followed by keepers and constables and invariably recaptured. Had Levy been permitted to leave or assisted? By what means was Bennett informed about Levy's new living arrangements in Sydney? And in what tone? How long Samuel Levy stayed with his family, assuming that the information was good and it referred to them, or whether there was further violence. But he was admitted to the asylum again 8 months later, much deranged. This time he stayed there 1.5 years before he was discharged by order of the principal surgeon, quote, "quiet and inoffensive." A month later, in May 1826, Solomon left Sydney with his son to pursue business in London. His bustling activity there and his success with prestigious Indian merchants drew praise from the newspapers. Samuel's family seems to have been reluctant to admit him to the asylum. There are many possible explanations for this, from the traditional distrust of institutions for the insane, to fear of social stigma, or the cost of maintenance. It could be that Solomon, after working his way into the ranks of the respectable and wealthy, preferred not to appear to need assistance. Or perhaps it was simply that Samuel was family, and they wanted to care for him at home. In established societies, families played a crucial role in managing mental illness well into the 19th century. They tended to use asylums for respite care, for temporary relief, for what were often long-term illnesses. Poorer families who likely had less capacity to adapt and less time available to care for each other used asylums more readily. In the words of legal historian Mark Finane, families like the Levys might institutionalize those whose demeanor, behavior, antagonism, resistance, or withdrawal failed to fit their immediate context, and take them back and repeat. Or perhaps it was a sadder story. Anne left Solomon, but she died in February 1824 after a savage beating by her new lover. Before she died, she had an emotional reconciliation with her husband, to whom she left valuable properties at Bulli, Bondi, and Coogee. Asylums offered families relief from the exhaustion and chaos, sometimes the violence of the mad, but also from their own troubles. In 3 musters across the 1830s, Samuel Levy was listed simply as missing. He's known to have died in Sydney in August 1872. Between the support of his family and his own resources, he appears to have established some form of regular life well beyond the reach of government and asylum for some decades. This story of Samuel and his family is about the porous boundaries that stood between the sane and insane in 1820s Sydney. It's also about the poverty of that binary, sane-insane. The story of John Grant, similarly, suggests the real limitations of that binary as a historical category. Though many knowledge systems, medical, legal, philosophical, have built up the sane-insane binary so as to help diagnose and treat illness, to determine criminal responsibility, and to discourse about human nature, histories of madness have generally produced a far less clean vision. Not a binary, but a great knot of symptoms and conditions and behaviours, which is worked not only by individuals but by families, neighbours, doctors and judges. And here in New South Wales, where governments theoretically held enormous power and could impose whatever categories they liked, at least on convicts, we find the representatives of government struggling to track down individual patients and to keep tabs on who was and was not in the asylum. Writing about the history of madness, this spilling of internal illness into the external world, naturally arrives at these questions of power and law, since the public response to private chaos is always a matter of liberty and power. Given this relation, it is not surprising that madness should have been such a common and contentious issue in New South Wales. As a penal colony, it was an experimental society, divided between punishment and profit, with governors and judges frequently confounded by the challenges of reconciling English common law liberties with the realities of planting a commonwealth of thieves. The benign kind, yes, who stole loaves of bread or bonnets, but also the frauds and murderers and rapists. And the challenges of planting such a society in a country already inhabited by people who are ready to resist invasion. We could say that madness is laid into the foundations of our city, our country, that it was present and played a part in the lives of those early colonists and the events which many think of as founding stories. Here in our settler state, madness has always been with us. This realization helps, I think, to break down another barrier, the one which still surrounds mental illness. Last year, in an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, Jenni Hill wrote about her son, then 21, who'd recently been diagnosed with a severe and unusual form of OCD. This after spending months in hospital and enduring a series of misdiagnoses and treatments that, she wrote, nearly killed him. In the months prior, many of their closest friends and even family members began to avoid them. She recalls a Christmas gathering where relatives talked at length about someone's knee replacement, but carefully avoided talking about her son's acute mental health. Indeed, they avoided talking to him entirely, as if what he had was catching. Sometimes, she writes, I wish my son had cancer. 200 years after the world I write about in this book, in one of the most technologically and scientifically advanced societies on the planet, we still have difficulty talking plainly, accurately, and with compassion about mental illness, and even more so talking without fear or judgment with those who suffer from those types of illnesses. We still fail to include and value and learn from those who think and feel and suffer differently. History helps open to us this breadth of human experience in ways we do not necessarily allow in the present. It allows us to talk about madness when we might otherwise be confined to stricter limits allowed by the term mental illness. This is important, and for more than intellectual reasons. Self-described mad activist and survivor of child abuse and of mental health systems, Indigo Daya, wrote on Twitter last month, I think mental illness is an impoverished concept. It grossly simplifies the complexity, diversity, and meaningfulness of so many important human experiences. It hides underlying social causes like poverty, abuse, and hate, making their real impact unseen, unchecked, ongoing. Part of the work of history is to make unseen impacts seen, to make unknown things known, and forgotten things remembered. In time, these interventions contribute to new knowledge and new understanding, and to the slow grinding of cultural change. In this, as well as in more direct ways, history works to check evil that would otherwise go unchecked. By looking beyond, underneath, and within words like mental illness, history can help reveal the complexity and diversity of experience. It can also reveal not only the underlying social causes of this inner suffering, but also its effects. History opens up rampant poverty and abuse, and all kinds of trauma and violence, but also shows how our societies carry these things and deal with them, and how the structures that give form to our lives have wound and looped around them. In his book Psychiatry and Its Discontents, the historical sociologist Andrew Scull writes that madness haunts all our imaginations. I think he writes those words from within the freedom and security allowed by history. Madness, he says, challenges our very sense of what it means to be human. Histories of madness allow us to engage with the phenomenon at an apparently safe distance. But as we learn about the madness in other times and places, we see that it is bound up into the very foundations of our societies. And inevitably we come to the knowledge of the madness in our own midst. We might let history help undermine and unravel some of our rationalist narratives. Let it wash away some of our fictions, some of the illusions about ourselves that we continue to hold tight. I'd like to finish with the words of David Stavanger, a poet and, as he says, lapsed psychologist. He shared this poem on Twitter on Thursday, on Are You OK Day. This is Depression is a Strange Thing from his book Case Notes, and he's given permission to read it. Depression is a strange thing. Anxiety is a strange thing. Bipolar, strange things. Antipsychotics beat a path through you, a loose log down a river without banks. They taste like a mixture of chalk and talk shows. Sometimes I wake up in the night, deeply low, only to find it's never light. There's a fog that gathers, accumulates, makes me drop glass and forget water. That slowly turns into a looping sound, then a chorus of choices. Often there is one voice saying many things. To surrender to the moon, to let biology tick, to get up like a slug underfoot. None of this comes close to the thick soup followed by the quick sideshow. I am my grandfather's blood, my family mud, the intergenerational trauma cartel. Anyone that writes about madness with certainty has never been mad. I'm certain of it. Certainty is the strangest thing. Are you okay? David wrote on Twitter. Not today. Likely not tomorrow too. Are you okay with that? My book is a collection of stories that make space for the accidental, the incidental, the suffering and sadness and breakdown which forms an important part of our history. It undermines some of the too coherent narratives that we've inherited and their assumptions. The result is rough and impressionistic and ungainly, but I hope that by drawing together these fragments of madness that are deposited across our archives, the book comes close to the experience of suffering, to the working of power and kindness, and the meanings of madness. I believe that writing these stories and reading them, acknowledging the incoherence of the world as they force us to do, can help to restore the place of disorder, of the accidental, the non-binary, the non-linear, the atypical. It can help us break down the boundaries that continue to produce stigma and shame, boundaries that protect us from difficult questions about ourselves, but in protecting us also rob us of the answers those questions might yield, and the vast and wild wealth of human experience. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. What an interesting talk. Thank you so much. Madness is such an uncomfortable topic, and perhaps to counter some of your assertions about your book, I find many of the paragraphs very poetic, the way you talk and when you reflect on history. So I hope that many people will read your book. It's fascinating. I have a question. I hope you won't mind answering. At the beginning of your book, you talk about how you came to be an historian, and you actually talk about history coming upon you by stealth. I wondered if you could talk about, becoming an historian.
Yeah, sure. I come from a family of readers. I'm one of 5 children, and all of us, I think, at least begun arts degrees. Not all of us took them through to completion. But my arts degree was very spread and scattered. I think the way an arts degree truly should be is, wide and broad. And so it was only my 3rd year, really, that I decided history was the thing that I was going to pursue. And that was only because of the influence of a teacher, Richard White. He's a great cultural historian of travel and tourism and many other things in Australia. And he led us in a seminar in my 3rd year. And he is just a wonderful, contagious teacher. He's so enthusiastic. He has so much fun with writing history. And that's just very clear from the way he talks and writes. So yeah, by stealth in that sense that it's not something I set out to do. It wasn't a plan. It just happened. And I'm glad it did. It
speaks to the value of arts degrees, which are a bit topical at the moment with the government.
Mm.
Jan has a comment. So valuable to scan the trajectory of our society's approach to mental illness, madness. Samuel Levy's story is fascinating. I'll be reading Bedlam in Botany Bay straight away. Thank you for this presentation, James. I do have another question, if you don't mind. I wondered what it was about madness that caught your interest, that made you follow the trail to write this book.
Yeah, I mean, madness is interesting in so many ways. And again, it wasn't a plan. It's not that I read something and saw there was a gap here that should be filled exactly. But I was actually walking through the city in the midst of the Macquarie bicentenary, so 200 years after Macquarie arrived in the colony, Lachlan Macquarie, the governor. And they, a big light show in Sydney, Vivid Sydney, was part of that celebration. And I was walking through just on a date with my wife, and she, we kind of were walking through, and they put up all these achievements of Macquarie on the buildings, partly that he'd helped build. But one of them was this Castle Hill Lunatic Asylum. And it just struck me as very strange what I knew about Sydney as a penal colony and what I knew about the ideal of a lunatic asylum. Even the language of asylum is about peace and rest and respite. It did not seem to fit at all. And it still doesn't seem to fit at all. The idea of an asylum in a penal colony still jars so much with me, and it's kind of driven the entire project through to the book. I mean, interestingly, Macquarie did at times talk of the penal colony of New South Wales as an asylum. He had a different view that actually it could be a place of recovery and peace and opportunity for those who are sent here. So, there is actually a mix of views there, but yeah, it's just that difference between a place of cure and a place of punishment that really struck me.
Dottie asks, where does hysteria fit?
That's a good question. My understanding of hysteria is that it's more of a late 19th century kind of a category of illness, and it's very interesting. There's been some wonderful histories written of hysteria. I think there's a new one that's just come out, published by New South. But in my story, it doesn't really fit anywhere. Before, I kind of go up through the 1840s, the last time in which Sydney was really a place of convict punishment. And I never came across hysteria, I don't think. I can't recall ever seeing the word. So, yeah, it would be the next book, the next
Volume
story.
2.
Volume 2.
Yes, Trish has a comment. She says, interesting how your arts degree led you to history, when many would see a qualification in history as useless as far as employment goes. Good on you for applying it to your life, love of reading, and your livelihood. Not a question, though. So, I would commend everyone to reading the book. I think you've got fascinating stories in there about, all of the collection of strange events that some people were engaged in that led people to believe that they were mad.
Mm.
There don't seem to be any more questions. James, do you have any final words that you'd like to give us?
Final words of wisdom. No, I mean, I thank you for your comments and your engagements. I mean, I agree exactly about the use of history in a time like this, particularly as I began the talk with the pandemic. It's actually now more than ever that we need people who can think in creative, thoughtful, interdisciplinary ways, and historians and other kinds of arts, humanities approaches have always been about critical thinking and about how we approach the world and how we make sense of it. And now is just a time that we need those ways of thinking. And so to kind of say, because it doesn't lead to a job that pays $60,000 a year or $80,000 a year, it's not useful to us as a society, seems really short-sighted, I think, and unfortunate.
Yes, we need critical thinkers, but perhaps that's what the government are trying to squash. I'm going to, there's one more comment from Jenny. Loved your book and congrats on the awards. I'm interested in your characterization of Robert Townsend. What led you to adopt Gooden's characterization of Townsend as a psychopathic personality?
It's a good question. I mean, so often there are minor characters that you come across that there are these comments that, so this is a small biography that I was relying on for Robert Townsend. He's a doctor who was involved in the Rum Rebellion and kind of an interesting character through Sydney's history. And yeah, there's a line in his biography which talks about his psychopathic personality. I don't know actually why the biographer wrote of him like that. And so, you know, to write this book, you need to rely on other people's work so much to write a scope across these decades and places that I wrote about. And so I'd be really interested to know more about what made Robert Townsend a psychopath for this biographer. But I don't know a lot about it, actually. So great question, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Also in volume 2.
Also in volume 2. So there's a list.
Yes, that's wonderful, James. Thank you very much. It's a fascinating talk and it's a fascinating book. And I just wanted to remind everybody that James will be back in WAM at 5 o'clock this afternoon on a panel about past lives, present tense. So you can have a chance to hear more of James' thoughts about his history, his book, and ask him some questions there. So we're going to close now. I'll thank the audience for coming and listening to James and for the questions and comments. They were great. There are many ways to purchase the books from the festival. One way is to place an order with Dimmicks in Albury, who will deliver free to Albury residents, very attractive, or for a discounted fee to other areas. So, and you can go to rightaroundthemurray.org.au. So Right Around the Murray is all one word. .org.au for more details to find out what's coming up, 5 o'clock, please, and to complete an online survey to go in a draw to win a 6-pack of festival titles and a dashing WAM tote bag, which you might have seen in one of the promos for WAM. Anyway, thank you again, James. It was a delightful afternoon. I really appreciated it. Very interested in your talk and your book. So all the best, and I'll be logging in at 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Jenni. Thanks, everyone.